Hello, this is Tony Heller from RealClimateScience.com. In 1988, NASA's James Hansen started the global warming scare before Congress. Following his testimony, the United Nations convened the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, a group composed of 300 scientists from 24 countries to review the existing evidence on global warming. They predicted that by the year 2030, warming in Antarctica may exceed 10 degrees Fahrenheit. This map was from a 1984 paper by James Hansen, which predicted 8 degrees Celsius warming in regions around Antarctica. He didn't do very well with that prediction. Satellites show there's been no warming around Antarctica for the past 40 years. April through September 2021 was the coldest 6-month period on record in Antarctica. The United Nations didn't do very well with their forecast of 10 degrees warming in Antarctica by the year 2030. And they didn't do too well with their 1989 prediction either. A senior UN environmental official says entire nations could be wiped off the face of the earth by rising sea levels if the global warming trend is not reversed by the year 2000. He said governments have a 10-year window of opportunity to solve the greenhouse effect before it goes beyond human control. As the warming melts polar ice caps, ocean levels will rise by up to 3 feet, enough to cover the Maldives and other flat island nations, Brown told the Associated Press in an interview on Wednesday. The United Nations didn't do very well with that forecast either. Over the past 6 decades, the Maldives and other island nations have grown by up to 8% in size. Then in 2006, Al Gore said we only have 10 years to save the world from global warming. He was given the Nobel Prize for promoting this sort of science fiction. Then in 2008, NASA's James Hansen said, "We're toast. This is our last chance to stop global warming." Now let's talk about the real world rather than the fake world of climate journalists and government climate scientists. There's very cold Arctic air spilling down into the United States and Russia. I spent a good part of the day shoveling the snow out of our driveway here in Cheyenne, Wyoming, where temperatures are forecast to reach a record low of -3 degrees Fahrenheit tonight. They're also having record cold in Australia, where cold air is streaming up from Antarctica. Yesterday brought the coldest November temperature on record in Victoria. The ski area at Mount Hotham, Victoria dipped to -7 degrees Celsius, the coldest temperature on record for November. Mount Hotham and several other Australian ski areas are owned by a Colorado corporation, Vail Resorts. They said that Australia just completed a record ski season. 3 years ago, Vail Resorts purchased the Australian resorts for $174 million. They made this purchase despite warnings 5 years ago from the Sydney Morning Herald that Australian skiing was doomed due to climate change. Vail Resorts pretends that they're worried about global warming, but the $174 million they spent in Australia demonstrates that they're actually not that concerned. There's a lot of cold air in Antarctica, which is making the southern hemisphere quite cold. Now let's look at this record cold air streaming out of the Arctic into places like the United States and Russia. These graphs from the Danish Meteorological Institute show the surface mass balance of Greenland over the past 7 years. The surface mass balance is the difference over a period of a year between the amount of snow which falls on Greenland and the amount which melts off of the surface. On average, about 370 billion tons more snow falls on Greenland every year than melts. For 4 out of the last 6 years, the surface mass balance of Greenland has been well above average, indicating a large excess of snow. They do their accounting from September 1st of one year through the end of August the following year. Since September 1st, the surface of the Greenland ice sheet has gained more than 200 billion tons of new snow and ice. Once again, it appears that they're headed for a well above average year. The press is full of claims that Greenland is melting down, but there's no truth to what they're saying. Reality is quite the opposite. However, it wasn't always like this in Greenland. In 1939, all the glaciers in eastern Greenland were rapidly melting. Like the glaciers of Norway, the glaciers of Greenland were facing the possibility of a catastrophic collapse. 100 years ago, the glaciers in Glacier National Park were melting so quickly that experts predicted they would be gone within a few years. 70 years ago, it was reported that the glaciers of Norway and Alaska were only half the size they were 50 years earlier. Had the same melt rate continued, these glaciers would have been gone already. It's very clear that the melt rate is lower now than it was 70 years ago. Now let's look at another story about Arctic sea ice which you won't see reported by the mainstream media. This year's summer minimum Arctic sea ice extent was up more than 30% from 10 years ago. And Arctic sea ice extent is higher now than it was 15 years ago when Al Gore won the Nobel Prize for his science fiction movie. At the Nobel Prize ceremony, he predicted the ice would be gone by the year 2014.
Another new study to be presented by U.S. Navy researchers later this week warns it could happen in as little as 7 years. 7 years from now. In the last few months, it has been harder and harder to misinterpret the signs that our world is spinning out of kilter.
He had no idea what he was talking about, and neither did any of the other so-called climate experts. In 2008, Norway's leading expert predicted the Arctic would be ice-free that summer. One of Canada's leading experts in National Geographic predicted the North Pole would be ice-free in 2008 as well. British swimmer Lewis Pugh listened to the scientists, and he tried to kayak to the North Pole during the summer of 2008. He made it about 30 kilometers out of his 1,200-kilometer journey before he got blocked by ice. Louis Fortier, scientific director of ArcticNet, a Canadian research network, predicted the Arctic would be ice-free between 2010 and 2015. He made that prediction exactly 15 years ago. It was a frightening projection for Arctic melt. And there's more ice now than there was when he made that prediction. NASA's Jay Zwally predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by the year 2012, and Mark Sries of the National Snow and Ice Data Center said, "The Arctic is screaming." The BBC predicted the Arctic would be ice-free by 2013. NASA's James Hansen predicted the Arctic would be ice-free between 2013 and 2018, and leading Democrats described him as being a prophet. The Sierra Club said Arctic sea ice will vanish in the year 2013. Leading journalists said the Arctic would be ice-free by 2015. Cambridge University's leading experts said the Arctic would be ice-free by 2017 or 2018. In 1958, the New York Times predicted the Arctic would be ice-free within the lifetime of their children. During the summer of 1958, U.S. Navy submarines surfaced at the North Pole. October 19, 1958. Some scientists estimate that the polar ice pack is 40% thinner and 12% less in area than it was a half-century ago, and that even within the lifetime of our children, the Arctic Ocean may open, enabling ships to sail over the North Pole. The bottom paragraph is also very interesting. Although the idea that a solid ice sheet covers the central Arctic has lingered stubbornly in the popular fancy, the northern cap of ice worn by our planet is actually a thin crust, on the whole, only about 7 feet thick. And now, 65 years later, the ice at the North Pole is 2 meters or 7 feet thick, the same as it was in 1958. But never mind reality and all their past failures, government-funded scientists are back at it again. They say we're having a climate crisis which has pushed the planet's stores of ice to a widespread collapse that was unthinkable just a decade ago. With Arctic sea ice certain to vanish in summers and ruinous sea level rise from melting glaciers now already in motion, a major new report has warned. The exact same story from 70 years ago. Dr. William S. Carlson, an Arctic expert, said tonight that the polar ice caps were melting at an astonishing and unexplained rate and were threatening to swamp seaports by raising the ocean levels. The same clown show goes on year after year, decade after decade, with experts making predictions of doom which never get any closer. They just make the same predictions over and over and over again. Toto's been pulling back the curtain on this mass delusion for the past 14 years. You can visit him, Kyrie Caesar, Toki and Upla on the web at realclimatescience.com.